In regards to the mitzvah of ha'anaka, which is giving gifts to an eved ivri, a Jewish slave, amo ivri, a Jewish maidservant, after they leave their slavery, the pasuk says the reason, v'zacharta, you should remember, ki eved ayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim, that you were slaves in Mitzrayim, v'yiftecha Hashem alikecha, and Hashem redeemed you, al-keina noichi mitzavcha, es hadavar hazeh hayoim, that's why I'm commanding you this mitzvah, this thing today. In regards to this, the Sifri says, v'zacharta ki eved ayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim, on the pasuk that's telling you should remember that you were slaves in Mitzrayim, says the Sifri, that I, Hashem, have given you gifts, and I gave you gifts again, as we'll discuss in a second what that means. So too, you should be giving gifts to your slave and give him gifts again. And just like in Mitzrayim, Hashem is saying, I have given you with an open hand, so too, you should give your slave with an open hand. The Sifri now goes ahead and brings psukim to show that Hashem gave us twice by Mitzrayim and with an open hand. So the Sifri brings a pasuk that says, a pasuk in Tehillim, in Tishkevun bein shvatoyim, kan feyoino nechpa bakesef. And then the pasuk says, ve'evriseo birakrak charutz. So we're speaking over here, the wings of a dove covered in silver and in gold, etc. So the Sifri explains that the first part of the pasuk, Nechpa Bakesef, is referring to Bizas Mitzrayim, the spoils, the silver that the Yidden got in Mitzrayim. V'avriseo birakrak charutz is referring to the gold that the Yidden had gotten by the Yam after Kriyas Yamsuf. Then the Sifri quotes another pasuk, a pasuk in Shir Hashirim, a similar pasuk that brings about, again, silver and gold. Toirei Zov Naseloch is referring to Bizas Hayam, again, the spoils of the sea where the Yidden had gotten gold. In Nekudes HaKesef, and when the Yidden gotten silver, is Bizas Mitzrayim. So the Eibishter gave the Yidden twice, and with an open hand, gold and silver and so on. In other words, the pasuk v'zacharta ki eved hayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim vayiftecha Hashem alikecha is telling us, it's teaching us that since Hashem had redeemed the Yidden from Mitzrayim and given them a double ha'anaka, this double gifts of the spoils of Mitzrayim and at the Yam, Al-Kain, says the pasuk, therefore I'm commanding you to do the same, to give the ha'anaka to the Eved Ivri and the Amo Ivriya also in a similar way. The Rebbe asks, if this is what we're learning from the pasuk, then it would seem to be that the main point is actually missing from the pasuk. The pasuk only says that Hashem redeemed you from Mitzrayim, but it doesn't mention in the pasuk anything at all about the gifts that Hashem had given at Yetzias Mitzrayim. Why isn't that being mentioned if that's the whole point of the pasuk? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this by first examining a little bit more and understanding the words of the Sifri, and we're going to compare it to the actual details of the halacha that we know how ha'anaka works. But first the Rebbe just gives us an introduction and says, since we are learning from the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim, we're learning the dinim regarding ha'anaka and its details, as the Sifri says, just like I did, af ato, so too you should give the ha'anaka and give him again, etc. So it's understood that we're saying that the spoils of Mitzrayim, the spoils by the Yam, were actually a halachic type of ha'anaka, real giving gifts. It's not only just we're giving something to the slave when he's leaving. In other words, we're really comparing it to the concept of ha'anaka. If that's the case, says the Rebbe, there's a number of things that are completely not understood. It seems to be very not understood. Number one, the din ha'anaka we know is specifically with things that are b'chlal bracha, that are considered, that have a blessing, meaning it's only things that could multiply or replenish itself, and so on. So the Rebbe doesn't give the examples over here, but this refers to things of fruits and animals, etc. But clearly it does not work with things like money and silver and gold and so on. Whereas the spoils of Mitzrayim and the Yam were specifically, the main thing was silver, gold, clothing, as explicit in a number of psukim and Medrash Chazal. So that's question number one, that seemingly it's not ha'anaka. Question number two, by a slave that was sold to a goy, there is no din of ha'anaka, there is no din of having to give gifts. So how can we say that the spoils that the Yidden got from Mitzrayim, in other words, they were slaves by Mitzrayim, how could this be a geder of ha'anaka? Number 3, says the Rebbe, the obligation of ha'anaka is on the master. The Sifri seems to be emphasizing clearly that the ha'anaka by Yetzias Mitzrayim was that Hashem gave it. In other words, Hashem caused that the Egyptians should give the Yidden the silver, etc. As the Sifri says clearly, Ha'anakti, I gave ha'anaka. Vishanisi, and I gave a second time. And I gave with an open hand, etc. The Rebbe now moves on to another similar idea. The Rebbe says, just like we find according to the Sifri that the Yidden got ha'anaka when they left Mitzrayim, so too it says in regards to Yosef. Yosef was a slave by Potiphar, and when he goes out free, so he also gets ha'anaka, he also gets gifts. And the Rebbe is quoting now from his father, from Reb Levi Yitzchak, who explains in his Rishimois, in his notes on Masechta Kedushin, in the Sugya where it discusses ha'anaka. And this is what the Rebbe's father says. Yosef was initially an Eved Ivri. As the Pasuk says, this is when the Sarah Mashkim is telling Paroi about Yosef, so he describes him as Vishami Tonu Nar Ivri Eved. So he's describing Yosef as an Eved Ivri. So when Yosef goes out to freedom, he also needs to be given ha'anaka. What is the ha'anaka that he is given? So besides for the fact that first of all Paroi gives him a special ring, and he gives him a special golden chain and linen garments, in addition to all of that, says the Rebbe's father, the main ha'anaka is what Hashem gave him. And that is that he sends Gavriel, Malach Gavriel, to teach him the 70 languages. Continues the Rebbe's father and he says, and don't ask, you shouldn't ask, isn't ha'anaka supposed to be from the master to whom you were a slave? So he goes on and says, yes, Shloimer, we could say, because from Potiphar he also got ha'anaka. And that is the fact that he got Osnas, the daughter of Potiphar, as a wife. And here again, the Rebbe says it's seemingly not understood, and we'll see the questions are going to be very similar questions as on the Sifri. Number 1, Yosef is an Eved Ivri, but his master is a Goy. So how can we say that he needs to be given ha'anaka? Number 2, if ha'anaka has to be from the master to whom he was a slave, then why does the Rebbe's father use the term Iker ha'anaka, that the main ha'anaka was the one that came from Hashem? And also, if it has to be from the master, so how is it possible to say that Paro's giving of the ring and the golden chain is a concept of Yosef getting ha'anaka, if again this is his slavery was to Potiphar? And finally, again, a similar question to before, that all of these things that Yosef got, the ring, the golden chain, the 70 languages, Osnas, although regarding Osnas, the Rebbe points out in the footnote, might be a little different. In all of these things, seemingly you can't fulfill the mitzvah of ha'anaka, which, as we said before, is usually things that replenish itself, and so on, the specific things that we can give for ha'anaka, not these things that we just mentioned. Says the Rebbe, even though this Rishima of the Rebbe's father is explaining things according to Kabbalah, but we know that we try in so many areas, we try as much as possible to show that Kabbalah and Nigla are actually aligned with each other, and they're not two separate things. Especially that we know Kabbalah and Nigla, the Torah, is a Torah achas. It's one Torah. It's like a gufen and neshama to each other. Kabbalah is revealing the depth and the secrets and that's hidden inside of the Nigla, the Torah. So therefore, we somehow have to align and to reconcile what's explained over here with the halacha as well. Says the Rebbe, we could explain actually that the chidush in this Rishima, that Yosef, by Yosef this is a concept of ha'anaka, is actually based on this same Sifri that we quoted, where we see, we're still going to have to explain why that is and how that is, but we clearly see that ha'anaka does work in a case also of an Eved that's sold to a Goy. It also is, ha'anaka could also be even with things that are not b'chlal bracha, that don't replenish themselves, and even if it's not coming from the master. That's what we saw in the Sifri. So the same thing is by Yosef. That number 1, even though he is an Eved that sold to a Goy to Potiphar, and number 2, even though the ha'anaka is coming from the ring, the golden chain, the 70 languages, and Osnas, and number 3, it's not even coming from his master, most of the things, but mainly coming from Pari and what Hashem gives him, And nevertheless, it still has somehow a din of ha'anaka, as we will explain now. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is that really in ha'anaka, in these gifts, there are really two parts or two aspects to it. There's one aspect, that which the master has to give. There's another point in that which the servant, the slave, is getting. In other words, what's being accomplished by the fact that the slave is getting these presents. And the Rebbe explains, the fact that the master has to give ha'anaka, that's much more related to his previous state of slavery. In other words, the giving that the master is doing is a show of gratitude, recognition to the eved, to the slave, for the work that he has done. In fact, there is even a svara that ha'anaka is not considered like a tzedakah, but rather it's like a payment, like a wage, like payment for a job. So that's all as far as the odin is concerned. It's more about what was. Whereas the benefit of the eved, that the slave gets from the ha'anaka, for him it's really very much a part of his becoming a free man. In other words, the shleimus of becoming free is if he comes out not empty-handed, but he's coming out with special gifts, which is clearly going to now cancel out and negate. It's completely the opposite of being a slave. Now he's a free man, he has plenty of money, he can act he has comfort, etc. Says the Rebbe, it is this second aspect of ha'anaka that it is causing the proper, full freedom of the slave. This is what the pasuk is emphasizing by the words "V'zacharta ki aveda yisa be'eretz Mitzrayim." That you should remember you were a slave, and that Hashem redeemed you and freed you, and that's why you're chayiv in the mitzvah of ha'anaka. In other words, since Yidden were slaves, and vayivdecha Hashem elekecha, Hashem redeemed us, that's why we need to make sure that the avodim amongst us also get a full, proper freedom and are released in 100% way. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand why the Sifri says that the spoils of Mitzrayim and the spoils by the Yamsuf is a din of ha'anaka, it's a concept of ha'anaka. Why? Because since the pasuk is discussing, as we just said, it's not so much about the obligation of the master giving the ha'anaka, but it's more about the slave being freed. In other words, it should be 100% full freedom. And if that's the case, then it doesn't really make a difference who he was a slave by. And number two, it doesn't even matter so much who is giving the ha'anaka, that it specifically has to come from the master. The main point is, in other words, it's not so much what was in the past, it's more about, the ha'anaka is about the present and the future, that right now this person has money and so on and so forth. He's in a state of freedom from now on. That's the main emphasis. And says the Rebbe, this will also explain why the ha'anaka by Yetzias Mitzrayim could be even from things that are not b'chlal bracha, things that don't replenish themselves. Why? The condition that ha'anaka has to be from things that are b'chlal bracha, that have the special blessing that multiply or replenish, that's more to do because of the chiyuv, the obligation on the master, that he has to give the type of ha'anaka that even sometime later it will be noticeable, his appreciation, his recognition, his payment, and so on. In other words, the master has to give something that's going to be long-lasting. But as far as what's the effect on the eved, in other words, the fact that he was fully freed, and he's now a free man, which happens at the moment that the matana is being given, and he's being freed. So it doesn't really matter so much that it's not going to have a pu'ula nimshechas, that it's going to be continued at later times. He became a ben chayrin, that's all that matters. That happens in one moment, he becomes a ben chayrin. So it doesn't really matter if later on in life there's not going to be much left from this money. Says the Rebbe, according to this we can now explain that this chidush that's learned in the Sifri, this idea that's being taught, that Hashem says, I gave you once ha'anaka, and I gave you again. And so too, this is the way you should treat your slaves, give them and give them again. And just like by Mitzrayim, I have given with an open hand, so too you should give with an open hand. In all of this is nothing to do, it's not telling you anything new as far as the chiyuv of the master to give ha'anaka, but rather all of this is also an additional point that the Sifri is making of how this has to be done, as far as the shichrur eved, as far as it's all part of the slave of freeing the eved. Why? Because as far as the chiyuv, the obligation of giving gifts that the master have, master has. So you could say that there's a maximum limit of how much the master has to give, where he's going to be yoytze, even lachatchila, even in the best case, even in the best way. In other words, he gave enough to show his recognition according to how much work was done. So you could say, I gave once, and I gave whatever is needed, and that's it. But if the Hanukah is about, if this aspect of the Hanukah is about the full freedom of the slave, so then there's absolutely no limit, because the more gifts he's going to get, the more of his own possessions he's going to have, because clearly a person can have possessions similar to a poor man or like a rich man, or as the Mishnah says, marba nechasim, you can have more and more. So the more possessions he's going to have, the more gifts he's going to have, the more is going to be added and going to be emphasized as what kind of free man he is. And that's why Hanik loy v'shnei loy, give him and give him again, beroich av yad, with an open hand. The more he has, the more is emphasized what kind of free person he is. Says the Rebbe, this is why we come back now to our original question, why in the Pasuk it does not say explicitly about the great wealth that Hashem gave the Yidden when they left Mitzrayim. All it says is, Vayivtechu Hashem Elokecha, Hashem redeemed you. Because what we're learning from Yetzias Mitzrayim is not the quantity of how much needs to be given. I gave you once, I gave you a second time, which happened then. But rather, the main point the Pasuk is telling you is that just like in Mitzrayim, the Yidden become free in a way that Vayivtecha Hashem freed you completely, which automatically would then include getting lots of wealth, and Hashem gave us once, and Hashem gave us a second time. But the main point the Pasuk is saying is, I did everything that's needed, that you should be completely freed. In a similar way, we're telling the Yid also has to do this to make sure that the Avodim should be freed in a complete way, and therefore practically what they have to do about it is to give gifts and give more gifts and give with an open hand, etc. Says the Rebbe, now we could go back and understand also the Reshima of the Rebbe's father of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, the questions that we asked there. Since Yosef was a servant, a slave, that got freed, so despite the fact that he was a slave by a goy, but he needs, as the Rebbe's father says, tzarich losses le'hanaka, he needs to be given ha'hanaka so that his freedom should become an absolute, complete one. And within the ha'hanaka itself, there are two details. The full freedom, says the Rebbe, his full release, simply and practically, when does that all happen? When Paroi appoints him as a Mishnah Lamelech. What could be a greater thing than he's not a slave, he's second in command now, he's second to the king. This is the complete opposite of being an Eved. And practically, when does that happen? How does that express? When Pari gives him the ring and he gives him the golden chain, etc. So that's one aspect in the Ha'anaka. However, says that in order for that to have happened, as a preparation to that, in order for him to become the Mishnah Lamelech, which is, we know, says the Rebbe, that the stargazers of Paroi complained that how is it possible that a slave that was bought for 20 pieces of silver, you're going to make him a king over us, etc. And Paroi says, no, I can see he's worthy of being king. And they say back, if that's the case, he needs to know 70 languages. So says the Rebbe, this is what this other Ha'anaka was, that Gavriel comes and teaches him the 70 languages, because in order for him to become the Mishnah Lamelech, what was needed for was that he should first be able to have the 70 languages in order to be able to then go become Mishnah Lamelech. And that's why, as the Rebbe's father puts it, is Iker Ha'anaka, what was accomplished by Yosef, on his part, that preparation, when he could eventually come to that full chayrus. The main thing that first happens in order for all of that to take place is the fact that he was taught the 70 languages. That's what we call that the main ha'anaka. Then as a result of that, now that prepared him that he can become the melech. As opposed to the ring and the golden chain itself, which he gets from Pari, that's only the result of what practically and practically what happened as a result of knowing the 70 languages. Then the Rebbe's father is machadish another point in this Rishima, and he says that the Hanaka needs to come from the master, from to who he was a slave, meaning Peitifar. Why is that? Because that, again, is adding another element, another detail in the full shichrur, in the full freedom of the slave. When he's getting from the master himself, giving him presents, because when he's getting presents from the very same person that first considered him as a slave, so now his freedom is in a much, much greater and stronger way than otherwise. Says the Rebbe, and this is why Yosef gets this present from Potiphar as well. He gets Osnas. But nevertheless, that's only considered secondary. The main thing is that which he received from Paroi, and the fact that he was taught the 70 languages, because it is these gifts specifically that actually accomplished the full freedom and release as explained. Says the Rebbe, this explanation al pi nigla, in the whole gather of, in the way Ha'anaka works, that the Ha'anaka is actually very, very much part and parcel and connected with the actual release and freedom of the slave. It's not just an extra gift that he's given. Says the Rebbe, this also fits with the Rebbe's father's beer of Ha'anaka according to Kabbalah. In that Rishima, the Rebbe's father explains that the level of an Eved Ivri, while one is an Eved Ivri, at that point he has what's called Moichin de Katnus. So Moichin is intellect, but it's still on a lower level, in a minor way, in a small way. When he finishes his work, when he finishes his slavery, he becomes a free man. The Rebbe's father explains over there that Chayrin refers to Chachma and Bina. Chachma and Bina is the world of freedom. So originally he's on a much lower level of intellect, but now he's graduating, so to speak. He's going up to these higher levels of Chachma and Bina. When he goes out free, he needs to be getting gifts. And the pasuk says Hanek Tanik. It's a double expression of Ha'anaka. Says the Rebbe's father that this corresponds to Chachma and Bina. In other words, the reason he's graduating, so to speak, the reason he's going out free is as a result of coming to the level of Chachma and Bina. But Chachma, and therefore from Chachma and Bina itself, is also being given these gifts, shining down into this Eved Ivri from the levels of Chachma and Bina. The Ha'anaka is coming from Chachma and Bina. What do we see from here? That the gifts that he's being given as he comes out to freedom is not a separate thing. As a payment after being a slave, he's now getting some sort of gifts. We're saying the Ha'anaka itself, the gifts itself, is part of the expression of going out to freedom, which is, again, in the language of Kabbalah, this is the idea of the Gilui of Chachma and Bina. Chachma and Bina is the world of freedom. These are the gifts that this person is getting. He's now getting the gifts of Chachma and Bina being elevated and graduating to much higher levels of intellect. Says the Rebbe, this fits with the explanation that we said before, according to Nigla, that the Ha'anaka itself is sort of what's causing or bringing about the shleimus of the freedom of the slave. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we could also say, the Rebbe says, B'derech Efsher, the inner reason of why it is that the mitzvah of Ha'anaka is only by an Eved Ivri and an Amo Ivri, a Jewish slave and maidservant, and not by an Eved Kanani. Now, the simple reason we could say is because an Eved Kanani, there's an obligation that says, the Torah says, you will give these, the slaves, you'll give to your children after you, you're going to keep them as slaves forever. In other words, one is not meant to free an Eved Kanani unless for a mitzvah or other things like that. And since Torah speaks about the majority of cases, in other words, usually we don't free an Eved Kanani. That's why Torah doesn't speak about Ha'anaka. Torah doesn't say that there's a mitzvah of giving gifts, because we're speaking about cases that are completely not regular, in a certain cases where you would have to free a slave. But, says the Rebbe, Al Pi Pnimi Yisrael Yonim, the matter actually needs more clarification. And the Rebbe says, in fact, on the contrary, if an Eved Ivri and an Amo Ivriya, which according to Chassidus correspond to the levels of Olam HaYetzira for the Eved Ivri and Amo Ivriya for Olam HaBriya, the Rebbe says, as it's known in Chassidus, so if they need the Ha'anaka, in other words, if these people of those levels need to be elevated to have the Gilui HaMoich and much greater levels of intellect being revealed to them, so you would assume that the Eved Kanani, which again, according to Chassidus, corresponds to the Olam HaAsiyah, to the lowest world, so you would think that he definitely needs to get Ha'anaka, he definitely needs to get these levels of moichin, of intellect, to be shining and revealed to him. But, says the Rebbe, based on what we explained, that the concept of giving the gifts and the concept of being freed are really very, very dependent in content on each other. They're really one and the same thing. In other words, they're both bringing out the same point. They're really one and the same. This idea is that the gifts are really highlighting and bringing out more the shichrur, the freedom. Says the Rebbe, is going to be very much understood. And that is because a yid, that his avodah is similar to the avodah of an Eved Kanani. In essence, spiritually, in his spiritual essence, he always remains an Eved. And therefore the concept of Hanaka is also not going to apply, as we'll discuss now. Says the Rebbe, it's explained in Chassidus, that the concept of an Eved Ivri and an Omei Ivri and Avodas Adam in a person's own service to Hashem is the Avodah of Birur Hamidos. Within that itself, there's two different levels, but generally both the Eved Ivri and the Omei Ivri are working with their Midos, with their emotions. Whereas the Avodah of an Eved Kanani, again we're speaking about a Yid doing Avodah, but in the style of an Eved Kanani, that represents more a person doing Avodah rather than with his emotions, doing it more with Kabbalah soil. Just like an Eved Kanani in the literal sense, that an Eved on his own, there's an expression in the Gemara, Behefkeira Nichale. What would a servant, if he wasn't a servant, on his own, what would he want to do? He would just like to be Hefker, just like to be free to do whatever he wants. So he's only serving his master right now because he's forced to, or because he's afraid of his master. So again, the Eved Kanani is just about the Ma'aseh B'Poel. He's not emotionally connected to his Avodah that he's doing. Nevertheless, even though the level of the Eved Kanani represents a lower level in Avodas Hashem seemingly than the Avodah of Eved Ivri and Eved Kanani, because they are serving the Eibishter with feeling, with Geschmack, with their Midos, nevertheless, there's really a certain advantage in the Avodah of Eved Kanani because there's more the idea of Bittul over there. His own self-effacement is nullification and so on. And the Rebbe explains, the Eved Ivri and the Amo Ivriya, that their avodah is to do with their midos. So even though, yes, they are servants, they're slaves, they're serving Hashem, also with Kabbalah, Soil, and Bittul, they are called an Eved Ivri or Amo Ivriya. But nevertheless, there's also mixed into that some sort of feeling of their own mitzias, of their own self. In other words, they feel good about it, they're emotionally connected, etc. Whereas the Eved Kanani, who does not have any feeling for his avodah, so his serving Hashem is purely and exclusively with Kabbalah, Soil, and Bittul to Hashem's desire, without any mixing of their own mitzias. Says the Rebbe, this is the inner reason of what we mean when the Pasuk says that Eved Kanani is, you have to keep forever, la'olam be'em ta'avodah, and can never be freed. In Avodas Hashem, what does this mean? That the avodah of the Eved Ivri and the Amo Ivri, which are dealing more with their midos, since it's very much connected with the mitzias of the person, their own mitzias, therefore, number one, it's always going to be a limited avodah. They're always restricted to whatever their personality is. And therefore, there is also a certain end. In other words, so that's why their slavery is going to come to an end, because they are limited. Furthermore, the shleimus of the avodah itself is going to be that ultimately they're going to go out of the avodah. They're no longer going to be these servants, these slaves. They're going to go out to freedom, which will mean they're going to be elevated, lifted up over and above the avodah of midos, and finally they're going to come to the level of serving the Eibishter with moichin, as we said before from the Rebbe's father, that freedom is going to be the idea of moichin, with intellect. In other words, it'll be tam v'daz, it'll be logic and reason. It's much higher than just doing it for your own, with your own emotions. They're going to be doing it based on full understanding, full moichin. Whereas the avodah of the Eved Kanani, which is Kabbalah Soil, which is absolute bittul, he lost his own mitzias completely. He doesn't have any of his own desires. There's none of his own pleasure and emotions, etc. He's giving himself completely away to the master. So therefore, this concept of shichrur, of being freed, completely doesn't apply. Number one, because this avodah, which is with complete bittul, is an avodah that's completely going in a way of bligvul, because there's absolute bittul, there's no mitzias. So it's just an avodah without limitations, and therefore there's no room for shikra, for being freed. In other words, it doesn't come to a stop, it doesn't come to an end. Number two, furthermore, there is no point of getting the avodah of moichin involved, which we said by the other avodim, because if anything, the avodah with intellect, with tam v'das, with logic and reason, would actually get in the way of that pure Kabbalah, Soil, and Bittul. And therefore it also makes sense, we now understand also why there's no, and this is the original question, why there's no ha'anaka, why we don't find the concept of ha'anaka to the Eved Kanani, there's no gifts to the person, because the gifts, again, if the gifts are about revealing the person's moichin, but here we're saying just the opposite, we're staying away from the moichin, it's absolute bittul. Instead, what there is only the moichin, only the intellect of the master. In other words, the Eved doesn't feel any of his own moichin. The only thing he has access to, or the only thing that's shining within him, inside of himself, would, if anything, be just the moichin, the master's intellect. Or to use the Lashon Chazal, is the concept of Shechina Medaberes Mitoch Groni, a person that has no Metzias of himself, and the Shechina is just talking through him. So even when he's learning, even when he is understanding something, the Rebbe says it's in a way of Itmar. Now what this means is, the Rebbe quotes over here L'Kutei Torah, where the Alter Rebbe says that the word Itmar means it was learned. Es hat sich gelernt. It was learned. In other words, it's not like even I learned. It was learned as if it came automatically. Why? Because Hashem's words just coming through him because he's standing with such tremendous bittul. So till this point, it sounds like the Evet Kanani is obviously has so much of a greater advantage. Says the Rebbe, nevertheless, despite the mile of the bittul that there is in the avoid of the Evet Kanani, nevertheless, the general avoid of Am Yisrael is compared to an Evet Ivri in a general way. In other words, yes, we said that within the Yidden themselves there are different levels, but generally Yidden's avoid are compared to an Evet Ivri, specifically, as it says, and the Rebbe is going to explain why that is. But first, where do we see that it's compared to an Evet Ivri? It says the Rebbe, it says in Chassidus that when the pasuk speaks about Sheish Shonim Yaveh, that the slave works for 6 years, the 7th year he goes out free, is a remes to the avodah that the Yidden are doing in the 6 millennia of this world. And then the 7th year of going out free represents the 7th millennium, which is a time of Kabbalah Saschar, of receiving the reward, and going then to an avodah that's going out free, so to speak, higher than the need of mitzvahs and so on. And the Rebbe says, just like it's general avodah, the same thing is true individually by each and every year. We have the 6 days of the week where a person works hard with lots of effort and toil, and then comes the rest of Shabbos where a person is freed of all that work and toil. But back to our point that we're trying to make. So why is it that generally Yidden's avodah is more connected to the Evet Ivri if we just said there is this idea, the advantage of the Evet Kanani? So the Rebbe says we could explain this, and that is that despite the amazing milah that there is in the absolute bittul of the Evet Kanani, but the ultimate goal is that we really have both avodas, both ideas. On the one hand, yes, bittul, that level of being nullified, but at the same time also having one's personal koiches hanefesh, one's personal own faculties. And that the bittul should permeate one's koiches, meaning to say, yes, you should have a geschmack and enjoyment and understanding and feeling in one's avodah. And it's not enough just to have a bittul without any chayis. Rather, you should have the geschmack. And this is why, says the Rebbe, the avodah has to be in a way of Evet Ivri. In other words, there's an avdus, there's a slavery that's connected with midos, with the feelings of the person, until again you come to that time when there's that going out to freedom, going the aliyah of the avodah of midos, going to the avodah of moichin, the avodah with tam v'das, until finally coming to the ultimate chedus, which again comes specifically through the hanokah, through those gifts that Yidden are given from above, the gilui of moichin, of intellect, which brings out the shleimus in their avodah shal pi tam v'das. The Rebbe concludes, it's known the Medrash, that Magid Dvarav Liyakev Chukov Mishpatav Yisrael, the Pasuk says, what Hashem tells us to do, He does Himself, the Medrash explains. From this we understand that the same thing is true regarding the mitzvah of giving presents, ha'anaka, that the Eibishter fulfills and gives as the master to the Yidden who are His slaves. Based on this, says the Rebbe, we could say that in addition to the fact that in the seventh millennium, Yidden are going to be Zoichet to Bashviyis, Yetzei Lachav Shichinam, they're going to go out free. But they're also going to get Hanaka, Hanik, Tanik Loy, that means extra gifts from Hashem. Says the Rebbe, since we know that Erev Shabbos, Erev of that 7th day, we need to be tasting from all of the cooked dishes for Shabbos, from all of the food of Shabbos. So the same thing applies in our case, that in addition to the fact that already now on Erev Shabbos, we need to, and we are tasting from the menucha, from the peace and tranquility that's going to be in the 7th millennium, there also has to be the taste already from the gifts of Hashem. V'hiratzin, says the Rebbe, that after we have the taste of the schar, and from the gifts, and from the menucha, the karev mamshu should be zoichet not only for a taste, but should be able to already eat all of the dishes that becomes part of our flesh and blood. We should be able to eat of all of the dishes of Yemoisa Mashiach and Tchias HaMeisim, which is the whole purpose of why the world was created right from the beginning, all the way to the end part of receiving the reward in Elef HaShvi.